As the howl of pain ended, and Rekos fell into a dreadful silence, Rachel bolted up from her dressing table and hurried out of the caverns. She knew the cry had come from Marcus, for she knew his voice, and her imagination spun with horrible images of what Dovain might have done to her friend. The cold air of the inner chamber sent a chill up her back, and she raced into the blackness to where she had left her friends. But halfway through the caverns, she spotted Atticus running in the same direction ahead of her. He had left Marcus unattended, she realized. In a long gown, she ran much slower than Atticus, so he reached the far tunnel first. Ahead, she heard his running halt, followed by an eerie silence. Panic rose inside of her, and she picked up the corners of her dress, forcing herself to run faster, almost slamming into Atticus, who stood in the middle of the tunnel around the corner. She stopped in time, and saw Atticus staring into the cavern ahead at Marcus, who was standing upright. His shaking had stopped. His eyes were sharp, the glossiness gone. The wound on his arm had vanished completely, and most striking was the reddened ring burnt into the side of his face. Rachel felt her stomach turn at the sight, and she thought she might faint. Atticus stood staring with his mouth agape, looking as though he might cry at any moment. Marcus stared at them, first at Atticus, then at Rachel, not uttering a single sound. Atticus stuttered. What is that?" he asked foolishly, knowing exactly what the mark he pointed to on Marcus' cheek was. The silent king closed his eyes tightly for a moment, and looked as though he might speak, but then returned to his expressionless state without a word. Confused and on the verge of tears, Rachel approached timidly. Did Dovain do this to you?" When he didn't answer, she gently put out her hand and touched the reddened spot where the burn encompassed. All at once his expression changed, contorting into a wretched grimace as his arms drew back as if to strike her. Rachel gasped and stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat and tears threatening to pour over in her eyes. But Marcus froze, his arm lingering in the air as his eyes tightly closed again. Like a cold ocean wave washing over him, a shudder ran throughout his entire body, and he stumbled, slamming roughly into the stone wall beside him. In another moment, the twisted expression vanished. He sighed deeply and ran a hand back through his hair, straightening upright again as he turned about and began walking slowly through the cavern. Atticus and Rachel looked at each other in astonishment, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But both of them began cautiously to follow Marcus, who traveled through the caverns confidently, never missing a turn in the darkness. If there had been any doubt in her mind before, she knew now that Dovain had seized control of Marcus's mind and will, but still he was trying to fight it. She was confused, unsure of why Dovain would be doing this, why he would attack and take control of his mind when Marcus was in such a helpless state. These thoughts flooded through her mind as the two chased after Marcus, who had led them to the main inner chamber of Rekos. There, the two were stunned to find Marcus bowed to one knee at the feet of the Dark Lord. Dovain looked up from the man bowed before him, and a smile crept across his lips as he asked in a whispered tone, "How many men have witnessed a king kneel before the feet of a god?" Rachel crept closer to her husband-to-be, keeping a watchful eye on Marcus, who seemed not to even move as he knelt before Dovain. "What is this?" she asked. "What have you done to him?" He gave a wounded look as he answered, "My dear, I saved him. Surely your little friend would have died if I did not grant him the immortality of my seal of darkness. He is only alive because of me." "Yes, but most of the men with your seal can still think and act for themselves. You have taken over his mind." But Dovain shook his head. "I have not taken over his mind, only his will. He may think and feel whatever he wishes. I merely control his body and movements. But his spirit is not gone, nor is it weak. If he was determined enough, he would be able to break free himself from my control. but his mind is weary from the suffering he has endured. For his sake, I cannot allow him to act on his own yet, not until he has recovered." "When he does recover," the princess asked, "then will you release him?" The King of Darkness grinned, and his eyes gleamed in the red glow of the chamber fires as he said, "Of course." Rachel nodded and looked at her friend. "All right. It is true. Marcus might have died." "Because of him," Atticus said, pointing his finger accusingly at Dovain as he continued. "Marcus wouldn't have been injured if Dovain had not attacked us." Dovain's eyes darkened, and he said in a low tone, "But as I recall, you entered my domain without permission. Rekos is no place for mortal men." "But," Atticus said through his teeth, "you're the one who took Rachel from us during the night at our camp." "No," the Dark Lord said with a decisive tilt of his head. "Actually, I didn't." Atticus looked puzzled at this, and asked Dovain what he meant. But having no interest in explaining himself to this belligerent child, he instead returned his attention to the King of Ghent, still knelt at his feet. With little effort, he willed the man to stand. Rachel watched as Marcus stood up and brushed the dust off of his knees. The motion was natural-looking, but she knew that even as simple a task as this must have been controlled by Dovain. Marcus's brown eyes stared off into the distance, a haziness in them, as though the man were walking in his sleep. The burn on his cheek was reddened and painful-looking, but Rachel doubted that he would be able to feel it. Without thinking it through, she reached out and touched his arm. Again at her touch the arm drew back as if to strike her, and this time she made no attempt to move. The hand again stopped in midair, and Rachel saw the sudden expression of confusion in Dovain's face. He waited for the hand to lower and strike the girl away, as most of his servants did when in this state. It was a defense tactic for people under the trance of his control. If they were touched, struck, or grabbed by another person, his servant would unwillingly strike in defense. But he had never seen anyone resist protecting themselves. To see Marcus's hand halt in the air, and then lower back to his side, was a bit alarming to the Dark Lord. He wondered if the King of Ghent was conscious of his surroundings, and was able to stop his defense reflex because he had recognized the princess. This was possible, but he had never seen anything like it. Rachel's hand remained on the man's arm, and she stared intently into his blank eyes, which gazed over her head into the distance. "Are you sure," Rachel asked softly, "that he isn't strong enough to act on his own? Does he have to be like this?" The Dark Lord nodded once, the glint in his eyes beaming as he answered, "Patience, my dove. Give him a few days to recover, and then he will be strong enough to break free from my influence over him. He'll be just fine. Now please, you need your rest. I urge you to return to your chambers and sleep. We have many preparations to make tomorrow if we are to be married." Silently, Rachel nodded her head and released Marcus's arm, excusing herself and returning to the fortress. Then Dovain returned his attention to Atticus. "As I was saying before, it is not I who brought the princess here to Rekos. It was your brother Salvador. He brought her here as an offering, and no doubt would have sacrificed her to me if I had wished it. But as with your friend Marcus here," he paused, indicating to the motionless figure between them, "I chose instead to save her, and I have offered my help in rebuilding her kingdom. She's going to be my wife," he said in a sinister tone. Atticus gritted his teeth and tried to control his temper. "I know you're deceiving her, manipulating her fears and wishes to get something from her. Her kingdom? Her people? Or perhaps you only wish to spite the goddess by claiming another of her followers. I don't care what your reason is, but I know that you're a liar and a deceiver, and I will do everything I can to prevent Rachel from marrying you," he said in a heightened voice. But there was only amusement in Dovain's eyes as he asked, "Oh, and what are you going to do about it?" Atticus raised his voice and shouted, "I'll kill you if I have to." "How?" the Dark Lord shouted back, the grin on his face contorting into a snarl. "How exactly are you planning to kill me? I am immortal, a god of darkness. You are nothing, and yet you dare to stand before me and challenge my strength. What could you possibly do to me?" Atticus shook, feeling the rage emanate off of the Dark Lord like the heat of a blazing fire, but he did not back down. "I'll find the goddess's battle axe that you stole from Marcus. I'll use it to defeat you, just as the guardian Altema planned to do all those years ago." An unnamed emotion flooded through Dovain's eyes as the memories of his people being cut down under Altema's blade raced through his mind. He heard their agonized screams in his ears once more. His hands began to shake and his teeth gritted together tightly as he remembered himself, only a child, forced to flee into the forest with the other survivors. An enraged growl rolled through Dovain's clenched teeth as he lunged forward. Atticus let out a sharp grunt of pain as a clenched fist impacted with his stomach. There was a strength behind it which he had never felt before, a mixture of dark power and unbridled fury. The strike knocked him back, and he fell to the ground, putting up his hands to defend himself from the figure which now towered over him. A heavy boot pressed firmly against his chest and forced Atticus back against the stone wall as the Dark Lord glared down with eyes that blazed. Atticus held his breath, the boot pinning him to the wall, and waited for the Dark Lord's next attack. But Dovain did not move. Instead, he steadied his ragged breath and lowered his voice to a whisper as he said, "Your guardian murdered innocent people. That cursed weapon, whose blade is stained with the blood of my family, whose hilt was wielded by that fiend, that battle axe is gone. I destroyed it." "I don't believe you," Atticus stammered, feeling a wave of fear wash over him at the thought of the only weapon capable of killing the Dark Lord being destroyed. "Believe me," Dovain hissed, "the axe was melted down, and the metal used to form the crowns which Rachel and I shall wear at our wedding tomorrow." The boot pressed harder into his shoulder as Atticus scowled up at the Dark Lord, who grinned triumphantly. But the grin began to fade as he turned his head away from Atticus to look over his shoulder at Marcus, who was standing still and lifeless, staring off at nothing. Dovain looked intently at the young King of Ghent, as though listening to him speaking. A curious gleam was in his black eyes. Atticus was confused, and despite his fear for his own life, asked, "What are you looking at?" The Dark Lord smiled silently and lowered the boot to the ground, freeing Atticus as he turned to face Marcus, striding slowly toward the motionless figure. "Your friend's body is under my control, but his thoughts are still his own, and I can hear them. They echo in my ears like a distant whisper. Our minds are bound together with my power." And at this his smile widens, and a mischievous grin appears in his eyes as he draws closer to the young King of Ghent. "Does it irritate you when I mention the wedding?" The expression on Marcus's face did not change, but the Dark Lord nodded as though he had received an answer. "I see. My, how amusing. I didn't expect this." Atticus shook his head in confusion. "You can hear his thoughts?" Dovain lifted his head and glanced up at Atticus, looking as though he had forgotten the Prince of Callisto was there. "Oh, yes. He and I can both hear each other's thoughts. No doubt he has seen exactly what I have planned for tomorrow. And of course, I can see and hear what he is thinking. I had no idea our friend was in love with the dear Princess Rachel." Atticus scoffed and whispered under his breath, "He's not your friend." Dovain gave a pouting look as he put his arm around Marcus's shoulder, standing taller than the young king and looking down at him with a grin as he gave a friendly pat on the arm and said, "Oh, of course we're friends. We understand each other quite well. I can see all of his memories, his deepest thoughts, everything. And he can see mine, poor boy. One must be bold indeed to look into my thoughts. But that's what friends do. They share secrets and memories. I can see his memories of you as well. I can even see that tragic night, the night you lost your parents." Atticus felt his pulse rush and the anger returning at the mention of his parents. They had been killed by exiles, the servants of the Dark Lord. Dovain grinned as if he could hear the thoughts spinning around in Marcus's mind too. "And that's when everything changed, isn't it? But you didn't just lose your parents that night, did you? You lost your brother as well. His mind spiraled into darkness, and he was vulnerable. I sensed that spirit, and even before the two of us ever met in the forest, I had already claimed his soul. Your brother's spirit was weak. I kept his thoughts in darkness. But you wanted to take him back, and you almost did. You wanted to save him from me and reclaim him as your brother. But I sent that little gypsy girl to the festival that day, just as I sent the swordsman who poisoned you. I had intended to kill you, but I failed. But Salvador was overtaken by a far different poison, and in the end, it turned you against one another. You drove him to me, Atticus, and now he is my most favored servant. And just as I have won Salvador's loyalty, I shall win Rachel's. Each day she falls deeper under my control. These caverns are devouring her soul, and tomorrow morning I shall make her my queen." And as he finished saying this, he turned back to face Marcus as he added, "And I shall never release you from your bondage. You shall remain my silent servant, and you shall watch every day as your beloved Rachel falls deeper in love with me." Marcus's eyes closed for a moment, and he looked as though he was struggling to speak. But when his eyes reopened, all traces of that were replaced by the same empty stare. "Even now," Dovain grinned, "your soul grows weaker. You cannot even gather the strength to speak. What a shame. I had expected so much more from the descendant of Altama. Perhaps you and he are not as alike as I thought." And with that, Dovain drifted slowly away, leaving Marcus and Atticus alone in the dim cavern. But before he left, he turned his head back and looked at Atticus with an amused expression as he said, "Tomorrow, after the wedding, I shall escort you personally to the surface. I have no reason to keep you or to kill you. You are, as I said, nothing to me. Until then, enjoy the company of your friend. It will be the last time the two of you ever see each other." And then he was gone, fading into the shadowy recesses of the caverns. Atticus timidly stood up from the cavern floor and crept toward his friend. Marcus had not moved nor blinked since he fought to defy the Dark Lord's control a few moments ago. "Marcus, I think you can still hear me. I'm sorry I left you behind. I should have been watching over you. I hope you can forgive me. And please, trust me, I will find a way to stop that wedding tomorrow. And somehow, I will free you from Dovain's control. I promise." And with a deep sigh, he leaned himself against the wall of the cavern and stared at his best friend, looking for any movement or change in his expression. But the figure stood silently in the center of the tunnel, expressionless on the outside, but raging in a battle of will within.